So the cerebral cortex is this outer layer of the brain which, when you look at it, looks quite wrinkled and crumpled up. Now, it's probably worth asking for a moment, why does it have all these wrinkles? Why is it all like this? Let's take a moment to think about humanity, the human species, and think about why is it that we are successful as a species? What are our advantages? Well, let's see. We are relatively large. We are physically large creatures. That helps. There aren't a lot of things out there that are big enough to attack and eat us. We are pretty fast. With our bipedal gait, we can move very quickly. And we have pretty good cardiovascular endurance. We can keep moving quickly for a relatively long time. All of those make us reasonably good at running away, but that wouldn't be enough. So what else gives us an advantage? And primarily that is we're smart. That humans do things with their nervous systems that, as far as we can tell, no other animal does. Some of those things involve, for example, communication. The human capacity for language is really important for us as a species. There are other animals out there that communicate information, but most of that seems to be like having a separate call for a predator that's coming from that way versus coming from that way. If you've got that, it's helpful, but it's not very good for transmitting knowledge over generations. Now, there are some questions about some animals, like cetaceans, like whales, dolphins, and orcas, or elephants, seem to have some communication methods that may be more sophisticated than we thought. But in general, as far as we can tell, humans are the only ones that can take abstract knowledge and encode it in a way that can then be passed on to other members of the species, even over time. So think about what I'm doing right now, for example. I have knowledge about the human body, somehow stored up here in this thing. I use that knowledge to direct my vocal cords and my respiratory system to work in such a way that it produces a pattern of vibrations in the air. Those vibrations are picked up by a microphone, digitized by a computer, and sent over a computer network that humans figured out how to build, and comes out as a speaker where you are, headphones or a speaker or something, which produces those same patterns of vibrations in the air, which impinge on your eardrums, vibrate your eardrums, which shake some little bones in your ear, which push in and out on a fluid-filled chamber, which sloshes some fluid back and forth, vibrating a membrane, which bends little hair cells, which causes action potentials, which sends a signal to your brain, and now you have knowledge of physiology. This is something you didn't have to go out and learn on your own, and neither did I. I learned it from someone else who learned it from someone else. All of this information is passed on in a way that, as far as we can tell, few or no other animals can do, and it means that each of us benefits from the knowledge that other members of our species were able to gather. That's an extraordinary capability, and it lets us be prepared for situations or to shape situations to our advantage. Another thing we can do is manipulate the environment. By changing the environment, we can make ourselves stronger, tougher, faster than anything else on Earth. We make clothing and other stuff that lets us survive in environments which are otherwise too warm or too cold for our species. We make vehicles that let us move faster and in different ways than our species normally could. We can make armor that makes us tough. We can make weapons that make us strong. We can do all of these things and make ourselves better able to compete than almost anything else on Earth. All of those capabilities come from this. That kind of ability seems to be a result of having cerebral cortex, this outer layer of gray matter. We have more of that than most other creatures. Put a star by that, so we'll get back to that. But having that cortex seems to give us the ability to make abstractions and do all of these interesting things. So, think about evolutionary history. Take some pre-human thing that's competing with everything else, and take some that have a mutation that lets them have a little more neocortex. And that extra cortex makes them a little more able to solve problems and thus survive. So that extra cortex is a survival advantage. So that mutation tends to be preserved. And those mutations keep showing up, and every time you get a little more cortex, your offspring are a little more survivable. So more cortex is a help. So what's the problem with more cortex? Well, more of this surface area means you need a bigger head. Now, you could have lots of cortex by just having a really big head, but the human skeletal structure means that the female pelvis has an opening only so big, which means a baby's head can only be so big before it can't be born through the pelvis. Now, if you want more cortex, but you can't make the head any bigger, you have a couple of options. One is to be born before your cortex is mature. And humans do that. When humans are born, we're kind of useless. Newborn humans can't really do anything. We are pretty much completely useless, I'm tempted to say, for 18 years, but that would be very rude. And it's not true. But really, especially our first year, we can only sort of move at all. It takes us about a year to learn to walk. So we're born, one of the reasons we're born so helpless is because if we matured any more, our heads would be too big to fit through the pelvis. The other thing you can do is crumple it up. So if you've got a big sheet of cortex and you need to put it into a small head, one thing you can do is crumple it and wrinkle it up and stuff it in there. So that's why the surface of our brain is all crinkly, so you can get more cerebral cortex in there. Now, if you look at the amount of wrinkling in the cortical area of different animals, it is loosely correlated, not fully, with intelligence. So if you look at a rat cortex, rats are pretty smart. But if you look at their brain, it's relatively small and their cortex is pretty smooth. Look at a sheep brain. Sheep aren't all that smart, but their brain's a little bigger and it's got a little bit of wrinkling. A chimpanzee brain is pretty wrinkly. Human brains are very wrinkly. Interestingly, dolphin brains are even more. Dolphins have large brains with a lot of cortex. Now, some of that seems to be devoted to echolocation, which is difficult. But we know that dolphins are pretty bright. So kind of an interesting thing there. But anyway, moving on. So, having all of that cortex helps us. Now let's look at another interesting feature of the cerebrum. The cortex especially, but also these subcortical areas, are divided into these two hemispheres. You can see that the brain, the cerebrum part, is largely divided into these two hemispheres, which are connected mostly by this one particular structure here called the corpus callosum, a set of white matter fibers that connect one side of the brain to the other. We mentioned that briefly in the last lecture. Now, having these two hemispheres, each of which with the gray matter that we are saying is the physical machinery needed to produce the phenomena that we call the mind or consciousness, makes you wonder, so do I have two separate minds in my head? And the answer is no, sort of. So let's talk about the two hemispheres, how they're similar and how they're different, and then some interesting information we get. So there's a lot of popular thought about the hemispheres. We talk about somebody being left-brained or right-brained. We talk about the left hemisphere as the logical one and the right hemisphere as the artistic one or the emotional one. And to a large degree, that is nonsense. Both sides of the brain are capable of most of the same things. There are some differences. For example, in most people, the left hemisphere is the one that can do almost all of the linguistic functions. Expressive language is mostly a left hemisphere function as far as we can tell, in most people. Now, there's some interesting things you get from this. My neuroanatomy professor in grad school underwent something called a WADA test, in which only one side of the brain is anesthetized. His left hemisphere was put to sleep temporarily, while his right hemisphere was awake. And while this was going on, he tried to speak, and all he could do was swear. It was funny that apparently the only language his right hemisphere could come up with on its own was the most emotionally charged language. Only the four-letter words would come out. Articulate speech, typical speech, seems to, in most people, be a left hemisphere function. So there are some differences, but they are generally overstated when people talk about the difference between the two hemispheres. To a large degree, both hemispheres do both things. All of that being said, in people who've had the corpus callosum severed, which was done a little bit for certain kinds of epileptic surgery for a while, we see some odd effects. Now, one thing is that each hemisphere does actually control and sense from the other side of the body. So my right hemisphere gets the sensory input from my left leg, left arm, left side of the body, and my left hemisphere gets input from the right side. Likewise, my right hemisphere controls the left side of my body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of my body. So imagine you have someone whose corpus callosum has been cut so that the two hemispheres cannot communicate with each other, or not very much. There are a few other connections, but mostly it's corpus callosum. Now imagine you take something, say a marker, and out of their sight, put it in their right hand so they can feel what it is. Then you take it away and say, "What did I just give you?" They can say, "You gave me a marker," because the right hand goes to the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere, which is the one that can speak, was able to talk to you about what you give. So now let's say you give them a different object, say a key. You put it in their left hand, let them feel it, take it away and say, "What did I just give you?" They'll say, "Well, you gave me a marker a little while ago," and they won't be able to tell you, but they will probably talk about it. They just won't be able to tell you what was there. So then you say, okay, using your left hand, put up a bunch of objects, and one of them is a key, point to the thing that you were just given. Their left hand will point to the key. Then you say, "Why are you pointing to the key?" The left hemisphere doesn't know, but it won't admit that. They will tend to make up a story. They'll say, "Well, the marker you gave me earlier made me think of drawing on the whiteboard, and I was thinking that at home I have this whiteboard, but I need to replace the key to the garage. So then I was thinking keys, so that's why I pointed to the key." It's probably not that the left hemisphere is a liar exactly, it's that it tries to explain, but it doesn't know. Now the question is, does it know it doesn't know? But that's a whole different question. So now imagine another interesting one. Give the person a key, put it in their right hand so they can feel, and take it away, and now say, using your left hand, point to what you were just given. Now, it was in their right hand, so the information went to their left hemisphere. Now you're asking them to use their left hand, and the right hemisphere doesn't know what they were holding. But from what I heard, what sometimes people saw in this experiment was they'd put the key in the right hand, feel it, say, "Now point with your left hand," and the person would go, "Key." Think about what just happened. Their left hemisphere knew what it had been holding, and when they were asked to point, that hemisphere, which could speak, whispered what it was, and sound goes to both hemispheres. The right hemisphere understood that and knew to point to the key. The left hemisphere cheated, which I think is kind of funny. But anyway, so in these individuals, there is some evidence that the two hemispheres are separately conscious and can even have separate trains of thought. It seems like what's going on is that in a person with an intact corpus callosum, the two hemispheres communicate with each other so thoroughly and so completely that they coordinate their activities to the point where effectively they aren't separate. But they seem to be capable of separate existence and maybe even separate consciousness, which is kind of a weird idea. But brings up whole questions about what is consciousness? Is there only one of me in this head? What am I, this thing that I'm talking about as me? All good questions, all with some interesting ideas, and none of which we can talk about right now, unfortunately, but feel free to talk to me about it later. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, so assuming for now that we're going to talk about the cortex as one big unit, we can also talk about where functions are located, because while the cortex's structure is actually pretty similar over all of it, it does seem to divide up roughly by area in terms of what different areas are responsible for. So let's take a look at some of those. The back of the head, the cortex right around here, we call the occipital lobe. That's the only area of the brain that really seems to have one job in most people, and that's vision. In people who are sighted, this area of the brain is responsible for analyzing incoming visual information and processing it in such a way that we can have the conscious experience of vision. This area breaks it down into finding out edges and colors and shapes and detecting movement and depth perception and all sorts of other things. Different areas in here are responsible for each aspect there. Now, Down here, this part of the brain, we call the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is responsible for several things. Among them is hearing. Sound went to the midbrain and then to the thalamus and then out here to an area on the cortex up on this part, the hearing area of the temporal lobe. It's also responsible for recognition. If I look at a picture, my visual cortex breaks that down into components and analyzes it and puts together the visual image, and then it's going to send that information over here, and my temporal lobe says that's a face, and with those features, that's my friend Ryan's face. So that recognition seems to be a function of the temporal lobe. I've also heard people talk about if you're a person who's an expert in something, if someone shows you a picture of a car and you can say, that is a 1972 Pontiac de Behemoth, because you can tell by the door handles have this particular thing and the tail, and all that fine knowledge seems to be temporal lobe based. Okay, now up here, this area we call the parietal lobe. Body sensation, touch, temperature, and proprioception are all handled in this area. The parietal lobe seems to be responsible for maintaining the map of space. So where you are, what your body is doing, where things are around you, just your general map of location in the space around you seems to be a parietal lobe function. It also seems to be involved in other kind of abstract representation. So, relationships between things. If you study music, you have some idea of you can think about the relationship between stuff within a piece of music, or language, the linguistic structures, or mathematical abstract relationships. All of those kind of mapping of relationships seem to be parietal lobe functions. So music, math, and other sorts of abstractions. Parietal lobe does other stuff too, but we're going to leave that alone for now. And then finally, this area up here is the frontal lobe. This is the area that is most different between humans and other animals. Humans have an unusually large amount of frontal lobe compared to other creatures, even close relatives like orangutans. So what does the frontal lobe do? It's responsible for expressive language, it seems it has a role in directing eye movements, but I'm not going to put that on here right now. It's involved in motor control. The initiation and planning of movement is a frontal lobe function. It is involved in planning, restraint, prediction, judgment, also working memory. Your sort of mental scratch pad seems to be a frontal lobe function. And what we usually think of as personality, which is closely related to some of these other things. So the frontal lobe seems to be responsible for a lot of the things that make us the most human. If you think about it, we talked about earlier in the limbic system. Someone cuts me off in traffic and I say, kill! That's my limbic system talking. It says, you have threatened me, you must die, I must destroy the threat. It's my frontal lobe that says, no, we should not kill them. If we kill them, we will go to jail, and that will mean we can't do this other thing we want to do. Now think about what just happened there. The limbic system is saying, kill threat. make myself safe, destroy a thing that threatens me. The frontal lobe says, let's imagine some future possible outcomes. If I kill that person, I will be detained by the police, and I will not be able to do these other things. Here's how my future will go, and I want my future to go that way, so I need to make a different choice. That ability to consider choices, imagine the future, and choose a pathway, or even shape things so that the future will go the way we want, seems to be a frontal lobe function. So things like imagining the future, predicting how things might go, deciding not to do the thing you want to do right now, deciding what would be a better idea. All of those seem to be frontal lobe functions. Those are actually a big part of personality, what you will and won't do, how impulsive you are. All of those, all of that is residing in here. Now, there is anecdotal evidence, I don't know how accurate this is, that this area of the brain is one of the last to mature during human growth. So it's certainly a popular belief. I don't know for sure whether this is true, but it's popular enough that it's fun to talk about, that this area doesn't even really fully mature until maybe your early 20s. So when I think about my kids, and times when they were younger, say 12 or 14, and they would do something very odd, and I would say, why? What made you think that that would be a good idea? Didn't you see what that would probably lead to? And if you think about what the frontal lobe does, and you imagine that maybe it's a little slow to mature, the answer might be no, because that's not the way their brain works yet. So it's kind of an interesting thought that maybe what we consider adulting is really just a function of a mature frontal lobe. When you're saying, I should do the dishes because I don't want the kitchen to be like that in the morning. Which, given how hard it is for me to do that, probably means I'm not really a functional adult, come to think of it. That's sad. Anyway, so that is a quick overview of the brain, and we've done the central nervous system, so next time we're going to be talking about the peripheral nervous system, which is involved in taking the commands from this and sending them to the body and bringing information to it from the body. We'll spend a lot of time especially talking about the autonomic nervous system, the part that controls homeostasis, keeping the body functioning in a way that is workable for us. See you then.